Well, this morning we're tying up this series on some of the parables found in Mark. And I want you all to just think about how much has changed in the 5 weeks we've been looking at these stories. I mean, just think about it. Back on September 1st, there was a Category 5 hurricane in the Atlantic. And the temperatures were in the mid-80s, pushing 90. And the Pittsburgh Steelers hadn't won a single game. But now, 5 weeks later, there's a Category 5 hurricane in the Atlantic. And temperatures are in the mid-80s, pushing 90. And the Pittsburgh Steelers neither have the Cincinnati Bengals. Therefore, something has to give tomorrow night, right? Unless they tie. Well, at least we have finally settled that trade war with China. And Iran is now behaving itself, and the politicians in Washington have calmed down. Anyway, we're at the end of this series. And during the last 4 weeks, there's been a theme in all the stories we've considered. In all of them, Jesus has used farming to make his point. For example, in the first parable, he focused on different kinds of soils, didn't he? And his point was that even though some folks might not hear the good news and produce fruits, others will. Therefore, it's important to keep sowing the seed. And in the second parable, Jesus talked about how a tiny seed, a mustard seed, can grow into a huge bush. Therefore, we shouldn't give up just because our impact seems to be small. And then in the next story, we looked at a farmer who was both incompetent but made up for it by being ignorant, and yet still saw a harvest, reminding us that the growth of God's kingdom is all about him, not about us. And finally, last week we talked about those wicked tenants who were given the vineyard but expected more, an example we should avoid as we consider what God has given us. Now, that's what we've covered over these last 4 weeks. But this morning, we're going to shift away from agriculture, because in our last parable, we're going to look at a man and his servants. And as we've done with each of the other parables, we're going to focus on 3 things. First, we'll focus on the story itself. And second, we'll focus on its meaning. And then third, we'll focus on the application. You know, how it might have been applied back in the day and how it might apply right now. And I'll tell you, with this parable, focusing on the story itself is actually pretty easy. I mean, when you get right down to it, not much happens. For example, it starts with a little introduction, sort of like setting the stage for what follows. Jesus said, "So watch out and be ready. You don't know when the time will come." We'll talk about what that might mean in a little bit. And then after the introduction, Jesus starts the parable itself by focusing on a man. He said, it's like what happens when a man goes away for a while and places his servants in charge of everything. He tells each of them what to do, and he orders the guard to keep watch. Now, this isn't exactly rocket science. The boss goes on a trip and leaves his employees. Of course, in this case, in this story, his employees are actually slaves. He leaves them in charge. In the Greek, he gives them authority. That's the word used here. He gives them power. But before he goes, he tells them what to do and to stay alert. Now, that's what happens at the beginning. And then the story shifts from the man to the servants. Jesus said, "So be alert. You don't know when the master of the house will come back. It could be in the evening or at midnight or before dawn or in the morning. But if he comes suddenly, don't let him find you asleep." In other words, Jesus recognizes that the servants have a choice. They can either act like those sharecroppers we talked about last week and assume that since the cat's away, the mice can play. Or they can do what they were told to do, especially since they really don't know when their boss is going to come back. And so it just makes sense for them to be alert. And just in case we missed it, we have a little conclusion. Jesus said, "I tell everyone just what I told you, be alert." Now that pretty much sums up the action. And as to some of the images we might want to consider as we start looking at what the story might mean, well, speaking for myself, as I think about the man, the boss, I'd like to dig a little deeper into what he did right along with what he gave and expected. And with the servants, what choice do they have? And what's the consequences of making the wrong decision? Those are a few things I'd like to know. And when you're talking about the results, why is being alert so important that Jesus used the same word 3 times in this very short story? Now, I think those are some of the things we might want to consider after we focus on the story. But I'll tell you, life gets more interesting when we take what we know and start to focus on what it might mean. I think it's important to look at and for this particular parable, I think it's important to focus on what's going on around it. You see, the entire 13th chapter of Mark is all about the return of the Son of Man, a title Jesus used to identify himself. And in describing all this, Jesus used language that's called apocalyptic. In other words, he used a lot of images that probably were meant to be taken symbolically, not literally. Like when he said, in those days, right after the time of suffering, the sun will become dark and the moon will no longer shine. The stars will fall and the powers in the sky will be shaken. Then the Son of Man will be seen coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And he will send his angels to gather his chosen ones from all over the earth. Now that's the kind of thing Jesus said right before this parable. And I think that offers us a lot of information we can use to figure out what some of the images mean. For example, since he's already said the Son of Man is going to return, the man who leaves in our parable probably refers to Jesus, the one who will be crucified and resurrected a little later in our gospel. And if he's the one going, then we must be the ones left behind, right? The servants who have been given a job to do. The ones to whom Jesus said this. The most important one says, people of Israel, you have only one Lord and God. You must love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second most important commandment says, love others as much as you love yourself. No other commandment is more important than these. You see, that's our job. And to do this work, I think it's important for us to remember that we've been given authority, power. And it's interesting that in the Gospel of Mark, every other time that word is used, it refers to Jesus himself. Like when Mark wrote this right at the beginning of the Gospel. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having what? Authority, and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be alert and come out from him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with" what? Authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Now that's what Mark wrote, which means between his leaving and his return, we have the same kind of authority he had. And so while the Son of Man is gone, we, his servants, have both a job to do and the authority, the power to do it. And for that reason, it's really important for us to be what? Alert. Especially since we really have no idea when our boss is coming back. I mean, I don't know about you, but when he returns, I want him to find me working rather than sleeping. And I'll tell you, Mark gave us exactly what this kind of, failure looks like when he described what happened when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before his arrest. And as Mark wrote it, I want you to notice how he used the same words found in the parable, and I don't think that's an accident. And then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." In other words, same Greek word, be alert. After praying, he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake? Be alert. 1 hour. Keep awake. Be alert. And pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them what? Sleeping. For their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to him, are you still what? Sleeping and taking your rest. Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. Now this is what not to do. And what's the point? Right now, in the time between the leaving and the return, the followers of Christ need to use the authority to do the job they've been given to do and to be what? Alert. Now, I think that's what the parable means. But as I've said before, the rubber hits the road when we focus on applying it to ourselves. And even though Christians who first heard the story might have felt a genuine sense of relief just hearing that Jesus was going to come back to them, I think his application for us is a little different. Let me explain it. Now, some of y'all may not know this, but there are plenty of Christians who spend a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort trying to figure out when Jesus is going to return. And they talk about it all the time. As a matter of fact, there are writers like Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye who have literally made a fortune, a big pile of money, predicting what they call the second coming and the end of the world. And I'll tell you, they've made all this money because they've been predicting it for 50 years. And even though Jesus Christ himself said, about the day or the hour no one knows, neither the angels are in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father, beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. Although they don't think they can predict the day or the hour, they do believe they can predict the month and the year. And that's caused a lot of sincere, and I want to emphasize that, sincere believers to spend time and money studying the signs of the return. And even though I don't think that's bad in and of itself, given what Jesus said, it might be a waste of money and time. But worse than that, it may distract them and it may distract us from being alert. In other words, our job isn't to know what Jesus said can't be known. That's not our job. Instead, it's using what we've been given to do what we've been called to do, namely to love God and to love one another. And if that's what we decide to do, it really doesn't matter whether we see Jesus descending in the clouds or meet him after receiving a call from the Grim Reaper. I believe Jesus will find us alert. And that's one way we can apply this parable to ourselves. And so there it is. 5 parables of Jesus found in the Gospel of Mark. And next year we're going to look at some of the parables in Matthew and then in Luke. And even though they may be a little challenging to understand, these riddles can really offer a lot of hope and direction as we go about living our faith in Christ. And speaking of living our faith, how we might do it, well, that's going to be our focus during the 4 Sundays in October. Amen.